Hello learners, today we will study a poem titled An Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's Return from Ireland, written by Andrew Marvell. He was one of those English metaphysical poets who enjoyed a versatile personality. He was an astute politician who sat in the House of Commons at various times between 1659 and 1678. He was born on 31st March 1621 and died on 16th August 1678. His literary association with John Donne, George Herbert and his friend and colleague Milton was lofty and meaningful. His poems include To His Coy Mistress, The Garden, an Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's Return from Ireland, The Mower's Song, and the Country House poem upon Appleton House. Marvell was born in Winstead in Holderness, East Riding of Yorkshire, near the city of Kingston upon Hull. He was the son of a clergyman, also named Andrew Marvell. The family moved its base to Hull when his father was appointed lecturer at Holy Trinity Church there, and Marvell was educated at Hull Grammar School. Marvell's initial poems were written in Latin and Greek and published when he was still at Cambridge, grieved the visitation of the plague and rejoiced the birth of a child to King Charles and Queen Henrietta Maria. He only tardily became sympathetic to the succeeding regimes after Charles' first execution, which took place on 30th January 1649. His Horatian Ode, a political poem penned in early 1650, reacted with grief to the regicide even as it eulogizes Oliver Cromwell's return from Ireland. At the age of 13, Marvell became a student of Trinity College, Cambridge, and eventually received his BA degree. A portrait of Marvell credited to Godfrey Kneller hangs in Trinity College's collection even today. Afterwards, from the middle of 1642 onwards, Marvell almost certainly sojourned the continental Europe. He may well have served as tutor for a noble on the Grand Tour, but the specifics are not very clear on this point. While England was entangled in the Civil War, Marvell seems to have stayed on the continent until 1647. It is not known exactly where his travels took him, except that he was in Rome in 1645, and Milton later reported that Marvell had gained hold over 4 languages including French, Italian and Spanish. T.S. Eliot commented on Marvell's style that it is more than a technical accomplishment or the vocabulary and syntax of an epoch. It is what we have designated tentatively as wit, a tough reasonableness beneath the slight lyric grace. He also recognized Marvell and the metaphysical school with the disassociation of sensibility that took place in 17th century English literature. Eliot portrayed this movement as something which happened to the mind of England. It is the distinction between the intellectual poet and the insightful and the philosophical poet. Poets increasingly developed a self-conscious relationship to tradition, which had intense focus on craftsmanship of expression and an eccentric freedom in references to classical and biblical sources. Marvell's most eminent lyric, To His Coy Mistress, combines an old poetic snobbery, the persuasion of the speaker's lover by means of a carpe diem philosophy. With Marvell's typically vivacious imagery and easy command of rhyming couplets, other works integrate topical satire and religious themes. This poem rejoices in a lofty way the military triumph of Cromwell. first over King Charles I and then over England, and it then goes on to predict more triumphs to be won by Cromwell and the steadiness of his rule over England. Cromwell very generously gave up the inglorious arts of peace and embraced the violent war life. He persuaded his star of fortune or destiny into activity similar to the speed of lightning, which is cosmic force of nature. He was able to pave his way through adversity belonging to his own party and also through his foes, and he went on to annihilate existing political and religious institutions in the country. In due course, he was able to defeat the King Charles I and to have him beheaded. It is ineffectual to oppose heaven's anger, and Charles' battle against Cromwell proved absolutely futile. Cromwell takes the credit for the manner in which he sacrificed his simple life and austerity in his private gardens and started his violent warlike career. By his assiduous valor, he was able to attain an elevated position and to destroy the political structure of England, which had been reigning supreme over the centuries. He sowed the seed of a new political system in the country, even though righteousness complained against fate and begged for the ancient rights pertaining to the royalty. Rights depend upon the capability of the men to defend themselves. A feeble man should give way to a stronger man because nature does not tolerate two human beings in the same place at the same time. It was therefore unavoidable that Cromwell should expel the king and declare himself as the ruler. While the civil war was on, Cromwell inflicted wounds heavily on the enemies. Not only that, he created a snare that the king could not find a way to wriggle out of it. By a masterly stroke of policy, Cromwell instigated the king to escape from Hampton Court to Carisbrooke and then had him arrested and put to death. As a performer in this drama of fate, Charles played his part with royal decorum and stateliness. The king made no offensive appeal to the gods to defend his helpless right, but accepted his fate with tranquility, bowing his head on the altar as if he were putting it on a pillow for rest. The hour of the king's execution confirmed Cromwell in the position he has acquired by force of arms. The executioner of the king was for Cromwell as lucky an event as the unearthing of a human skull was for Rome in the course of certain earthly explorations. The next accomplishment of Cromwell was his conquest over Irish people. The Irish people soon afterwards themselves realized that Cromwell was a fine individual, just and fit for the highest trust. Cromwell, of his military victories, but unrelentingly obeyed the wishes of the public. He was like a falcon, a bird of prey, which in spite of its ferocity obeys its master. England can happily dream about great hopes about her future on the basis of Cromwell's victories, which projected him to be a great conqueror as Caesar or Hannibal. Now, the Scots will also find no protection, but will try to hide themselves from Cromwell's attack. Having portrayed this character and an achievement of Cromwell, the poet stops eulogizing the king and wishes him all the best for his future. Let Cromwell march onwards tirelessly, and let him keep his sword erect, in order to drive away all evil spirits, and thus to maintain the power which he had won by the sword. Now, let us look at what Horatian ode means. It is a short lyric poem written in stanzas of 2 or 4 lines in the manner of the 1st century BC Latin poet Horace. This poem is in contrast to the lofty heroic odes of the Greek poet Pindar. Most of Horace's odes are cherished and insightful. They are often addressed to a friend and are woven around friendship, love, and the skills of poetry. Horace introduced early Greek lyrics into Latin by acclimatizing with Greek meters, pruning them structurally, and writing his Romanized versions with a discipline that caused some loss of spontaneity and a sense of impassiveness, but produced a lot of grace and decorum. But he warned Latin writers not to make an attempt to imitate Pindar, a task that he likened to Icarus' insolent flight. Horace's Carmina, written in stanzas of 2 or 4 lines, are now collectively called odes. But they have nothing in common with the passionate vividness of Pindaric odes. Horace's tone is generally somber and serene, often touched with irony and melancholy, but sometimes intermittent with gentle humor. His urbane Epicureanism and personal charm, his aphoristic philosophy and studied excellence won him appreciation as Rome's leading poet after the death of his friend Virgil. In later periods, when technical expertise was given more importance than imagination and spontaneity, Horace's odes were valued and emulated. Among the poets of Pleiad in 16th century France, Pere de Ronsard attempted to model his first odes on Pindar. Defeated, he satisfied himself with being, in his opinion, better than Horace. Nicolas Boyle and Jean de La Fontaine in the 17th century safeguarded the Horatian tradition. Michael Drayton, in poems Lyric and Pastoral, accepted his gratitude to Horace, and Andrew Marvell produced one of the finest English Horatian odes in 1650 on Cromwell's return from Ireland. In the early 18th century, Matthew Prior, Jonathan Swift and Samuel Johnson revived the Horatian spirit. Since the odes of the Romantic period, which were winning imitations of the manner but not the form of Pindar, few English poets have decided to return to the classical forms. Now, let us look at Marvell's patriotic poems. However, there was another streak in Marvell. He was an ardent patriot, and patriotism rather than piety may be said to encourage his verses on Cromwell's territory and depth. Patriotism is the central note, and Horatian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland, first anniversary of government under His Highness, the Lord Protector, and poem upon the death of His late Highness and Lord Protector. A sort of contest of poets in which Waller and Dryden took part was aggravated by the great man's death, and Marvell bore its price because in his verses the man speaks through the poet. These verses are deep with varied hues of human emotions. Better than others, Marvell creates the impression of the greatness of Cromwell and enormity of the loss which his death led to. Marvell's literary reputation mainly rests upon his poems. Yet weirdly or strangely enough, these were barely known at all to his contemporaries. Some of them were spread through manuscripts after the manner of the time and were probably read by Milton and other personal friends. But with few exceptions, they were not given to the world in printed form till 3 years after his death. Of his first really great work, an Horatian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland, has been said that better than anything else in the language, it paints the picture of a grand Horatian measure moving as it does from end to end, with the sombre beat of its singular meter, strophe and antistrophe with epode following. All its stanzas unite force with grace and novelty with charm. Marvell's patriotic verse is interesting in a unique way. One poem is worthy of special consideration, that is, an Horatian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland. This poem runs on in a somewhat indirect and self-indulgent course like all Marvell's longer poems. The streak of intelligence about King Charles' head being as lucky as that which was found when they were digging the foundations of Rome, and the fun he makes at the Scottish and the Irish are attributes of Marvell. So is the view taken that Cromwell made a huge sacrifice in relinquishing a private life, which we get also in Marvell's prose. So is the touch about Cromwell's garden, where he lived reserved and austere, as if his highest plot to plant the bergamot. Even today, in an age which takes pride in its tolerant spirit, it gives the reader a surprise to find that the stanzas about Charles, which present the very image of haughty saint and martyr, come in a poem written to honor and venerate a man to whom Charles owed his death. These two stanzas, from lines 57 to 64, are now the only part of the poem that is remembered, and justly semicolon for the rest of the poem. Although Horatian in form and spirit, has little of the curiosa felicitas of Horace articulation to make it unforgettable. The domineering facet of Marvell's poetry is its balance, its encompassing sense of unique proportion. He is perhaps the significant poet of judgment in the English language, and an Horatian ode is his popular poem. The word judgment indicates lofty quality which presents, balances and appraises a whole situation, seeing all the propositions and never attempting to simplify them. The poet's whole endeavour is directed towards a full and subtle sanity, so that what he finally achieves is a kind of unbiased personality. The poem gets its strength and charm by the certainty with which he balances the large chunk of religious and political context against a personal judgment, so that both appear necessary parts of a whole to understand the complete situation. Some of the lines in the poem have been considered as an example of political ambiguousness, as if Marvell were praising Cromwell while essentially supporting the king. But what in fact is so striking in the poem is certitude with which the poet categorizes the various threads, so that he can continue his work without disarray, in the full knowledge of what his outlook on the subject really are. Personal penchant and natural wisdom hold each other in check. This manner of opposing two ways of thinking and feeling is, of course, typical of a good deal of metaphysical poetry. But in Marvell's work, the personal balance is already accomplished before the poem begins. He approaches his subjects fully aware of his personal prejudice, and yet his mind plays in a disconnected manner over a number of substitutes. We also find some kind of refinement in Marvell's judgment. With the exception of George Herbert, Marvell is the most significant of Donne's followers, but his metal is quite different and unique. He is far more vigilantly and closely a craftsman in poetry, and this went with a different poetic attitude also. The vivacity of Donne's poetry depends on his ability of taking on everything that comes with the same closeness, accuracy and full astuteness. It is, in a sense, poetry of action. Marvell, however, is always a little further outside his subjects. His astonishingly civilized erudition is a fixed quantity. With it, he weighs and judges his material with such unruffled fairness as to leave us with the mature intricacy of his judgment. Unlike Donne and Herbert, he never writes a poem which shows him in the process of attaining this maturity. It is rather a quality without which he indulges in the process of reaching the stage of his mellowness. It is rather a quality without which he would not have been able to begin to write. The magnitude of Marvell's poetry is huge. The fact that the Puritans were illustrious by a distrust of all the arts is not endorsed or accepted by the history of 17th century poets. The Anglican Herbert and Vaughan trusted poetry so far that they tried to make it the medium of strict tenets of religion. It was the Puritan Andrew Marvell who first appreciated that the writing of secular verse, like any other act, might be done to edification, and that the mute might be made respectable without going to the church. This discovery, which is indirectly quoted in his poem called The Coronet, saved him from the worries of conscience that has assaulted Donne, Herrick and Vaughan. Gifted by nature with an extraordinary receptivity to beauty in all its forms, he was able to indulge in it with a serene mind. An absolute intuition leads him towards pretentiousness on one hand and carelessness on the other. He could write in the metaphysical style of Donne without mimicking his brutality, and he attained something of Herrick's witty delicacy without any exaggeration. Marvell was extremely adaptable. Marvell wrote well in any mood. A remarkable example of this is found in the Times in the lines to his coy mistress, which begin in a mood of playful pummel and end in a tragic fury. Only Marvell among the poets of his time could have altered the process of thought so hurriedly without obliterating the unity of the poem. His nature poetry is interesting, not only for Wordsworthian mood of introspection which it expresses, but also for his affirmed fondness for the wilder aspects of nature. His satires are often incisive and humorous. A sporadic grossness of language seems to have been exacted from him by his subject. He had not learnt Dryden's art of making victims die sweetly, and his mastery of the couplet is flawed. He is much better in his adulations on verses on Cromwell, especially in an Horatian ode. This poem alone would promise Marvell a high place among the English poets. Now let us see the connection between Marvell and nature. Marvell was among the first of the English poets to feel the varied hues of nature with romantic passion, and at the same time with meticulous pragmatism. The major works on nature poetry was written between his 29th and 35th years while he was living in country seclusion at Nunn Appleton, as tutor to the young daughter of Lord Fairfax, commander-in-chief of the parliamentary forces opposing King Charles I. The main evidence of these 2 years of poetic life is a long poem entitled Upon Appleton House. Besides this, the most significant of his country poems are perhaps The Garden and The Mower to the Glowworms. In later life, Marvell served for a time as assistant to Milton, then acting as Latin secretary to Cromwell's government. He helped Milton in his blindness, aided him to escape from his followers at the Restoration, and watched him with mingled administration and awe the progress of Paradise Lost, which began about 1658 or in the year 1658 to take shape after 20 years of delay. In the noble Ode to Cromwell, Marvell set an example, laudable of Milton himself, of simple poise and classical restraint in handling of a political theme. And it is to this poem that we owe the description of Cromwell's opponent Charles I, on the scaffold in lines which more than anything ever written make him memorably the noble martyr. He nothing common did or mean upon the memorable scene. To conclude, this poem highlights the lifestyle of Cromwell and gives a strong message about his patriotic fervour to his readers. I hope you enjoyed this poem and the patriotic fervour that pervaded throughout. Thank you.